No image of our favorite secret agent would be complete without the fantastic theme that carries his name. Everyone knows immediately where it comes from, and no James Bond film would be complete without it. It's remarkable that a theme that was constructed for one type of Bond, the cat-like cool of Sean Connery, is so adaptable that it may work well with all the other types. The tongue-in-cheek charm of Moore, the solemn Dalton, the tough Brosnan, and the emotional Craig. Beyond that, and the title songs for each of the films, most people don't seem to actually delve into the musical scores themselves. At least from what I've come across. There's more to the musical identity of 007 than the James Bond theme and the title track for each film. Inspired by the celebrations for the 60th anniversary that seem to center around the music of James Bond, I decided to try an exercise that I don't really see a lot of other fans attempt: try to rank the soundtracks themselves. This is a really difficult task because there's only one score that I don't like, and all the rest have at least one fantastic moment where the music is married to the film. I'm certainly more partial to some scores than others, and I thought this yielded some interesting results because I'm trying to judge the scores independently of their respective film's quality, or, for the most part, the lyrical version of a film's title track. However, I will be mentioning secondary tracks like Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Surrender, We Have All the Time in the World, and the Pretenders tracks from Living Daylights, as these tracks are more often than not included as melodies throughout the score, much like the title tracks, and I don't really see a lot of people talk about these. I'm curious to see if there's any consensus amongst viewer and fans, or if most people just like the films and don't notice the soundtrack for the most part. With that said, let's get to it. It's not that Dr. No is a truly terrible soundtrack, but it's so at odds with the rest of the series that I almost never return to the score apart from the film. I've also never really cared for the almost archival quality the score possesses in its recording and mixing techniques. It's not nearly as rich or lively as its successors, and it almost seems muted in emotion. It's more befitting of a generic spy film from the 1940s or the 1950s, and tends to follow very traditional film scoring techniques and practices, such as rising strings for a jump scare. So it doesn't really hold that much complexity for me. Apart from the John Barry recording of the James Bond theme, which is so iconic, and the lovely little melody that is underneath the mango tree, there's just so little to recommend about this score. It's a rather unique one because it's trying to find the musical voice of the series when there really wasn't a precedent for such. And it may seem harsh to bash on this one since it was a pioneer in those endeavors. But unfortunately, the sound of the series turned out to be quite different from what Monty Norman composed, and so the original film score is the weakest in my lineup. I've never cared for either of Thomas Newman's efforts, despite him being a great composer. Spectre does have some lovely iterations of the Bond theme, especially in the opening scene, but the soundtrack is so similar to Skyfall's that it doesn't really stand out on its own. It doesn't really seem to have a unique identity. Part of that is the constant reuse of the Skyfall score, and both Skyfall and Spectre are very competent scores that get the job done, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to remember a musical moment from Spectre that didn't include the film's title track or that wasn't recycled from Skyfall. Something else that bugs me about Newman's scores is how they shy away from the identity of the series. Not only is the Bond theme really sparse in either his two efforts, but something that John Barry and David Arnold tended to do was to use instrumental versions of the title track as a theme that plays throughout the film. It's not a terribly original idea in film scoring, but the Bond films rarely rely on recurring musical motifs throughout the series, like Lord of the Rings, and so the title song within the score really helps the music to be more memorable and to add some storytelling complexity within the music. Newman does not employ this technique, and so his scores mostly feel plodding to me and seem to be just filler material. I think you could copy and paste this score into any random action or spy film from the 2010s, and I doubt you'd notice much of a difference for about 80% of the movie. The soundtrack for GoldenEye gets a bit of a bad rap amongst fans, and I think it's pretty easy to hear why that is. It often seems to play rather dated 80s synth during several scenes. Sometimes the romantic music is really cheesy, and it's often inserted into places where it doesn't really fit, such as Xenia's introduction in the casino. And the end credits song, The Experience of Love, is hands down the worst song ever done for a Bond film. I'm pretty sure I've never actually been able to sit through it for a casual listen. However, the score itself does have a bit of merit. It's got a really unique sound, and I just love the heavy percussion bit that repeats throughout the film. Some of the action bits are really good, such as the facility sequence, the archive shootout, and the music that plays during Bond and Trevelyan's fight on the cradle. I guess the style is the best thing that GoldenEye has going for it, and I can't deny that there are some really cool moments of music throughout this score. The Nintendo 64 game's soundtrack does take inspiration from the films, and I think actually improves upon it. I can't really imagine this film without this score, but it's those misuses of music that I mentioned that really hurt this one. Plus, the use of the Bond theme during the tank chase has always kind of bugged me a little bit. It feels just a bit restrained in the sound mixing to me, and feels a little slapdash, though I suppose that's a forgivable sin to make, given that the track was a last-minute substitution for Eric Serra's track, A Pleasant Drive in St. Petersburg, which is not one that I care for. GoldenEye's score is not without bright spots, but it's got enough missteps that I can't really recommend it, and like Dr. No, I rarely listen to it apart from the film. I feel like I've usually got a good idea which of my opinions are unpopular ones, but I'm curious to see if this placement is going to ruffle some feathers. The Spy Who Loved Me brings in the series' fourth composer, and Marvin Hamlish certainly injects his own style and sound. Much like Eric Serra's GoldenEye, I don't think you're going to be able to mistake a single track from this film for one of the other films in the series. Hamlish wanted to bring a Bee Gees-esque rhythm to the Bond theme, and that makes for some really cool moments. However, the rest of the score fails to live up to that. It often uses recognizable music from other sources, which is a trend I don't care for, because sometimes it feels a bit too comedic, like the Lawrence of Arabia bit as Bond and Anya walk through the desert. Plus, like GoldenEye, it's got several moments where the music feels either overblown or a bit inappropriate, like Anya's reveal at the pyramids, or Anya's theme itself. Listening to that apart from the soundtrack, it just kind of sounds like it belongs in a local Shakespeare play. I do go back to this one occasionally, but it doesn't sit well with me during certain sections of the film, and I think the actual soundtrack release is amongst the weakest of the Bond albums we've had so far. It's kind of hard to explain why this one doesn't work for me, as well as other unique Roger Moore efforts. Spy Who Loved Me does not contain a terrible score, but something has to come lower, and this one's just never really been a favorite for me. The better of the two offerings from Thomas Newman, Skyfall is inherently more appealing to me than Spectre. It uses more original music, it uses the Bond theme more often, and it has some solid action music throughout. It also has the sounds of espionage down pat. My favorite bits include the pre-title sequence, the Shanghai Drive, and the entrance to the casino in Macau. My biggest issues with this score are the lack of character themes running throughout, which only seems odd to me here given the more character-driven focus of this film, and how the music often just doesn't feel like anything unique. It's got moments where it undeniably has the Bond characteristics, like the reuse of Adele's Skyfall when Bond enters the casino in Macau, but most of the time it's a very understated score and contains a lot of filler material that wouldn't feel out of place in a Jason Bourne or Captain America film. Like the movie itself, I am warming to the score the more I listen to it, but it does end up on the lower end of my ranking because I don't really return to the soundtrack itself that much. Here we go, the first John Barry entry on the list. It really can't be overstated how much this man helped to define the sound of a Bond film, and even though this is my pick for his worst score, it's far from being unlistenable. However, it does seem like the most generic of Barry's scores in almost every way, and it doesn't stand out as much as I would like. A tendency that I've noticed that Barry had during the Roger Moore era was to limit his recognizable themes to just the Bond theme, the main title song as the romantic piece, and a cool action bit. Here, the title song is reworked to be used as both the action bit and the romantic underscore, much how like the main action theme in Pirates of the Caribbean is just the love theme sped up and orchestrated with a bit more punch. I guess I have to admire the skill it takes to have a theme play double duty, but it does mean that there aren't a whole lot of memorable bits of music outside of those two themes. Even the Scaramanga Funhouse bits feel a bit too similar to other suspense cues from his other efforts. Plus, Barry is reportedly responsible for the slide whistle that plays over the car barrel roll stunt, which is the coolest moment in the film and kind of wrecks it. Shame on you for that, Barry. Shame. The score overall does have some nice uses of the title theme. It's got a great symphonic version of the Bond theme that Barry often replicated for his other more offerings. And I do like some of the Eastern Asian influence in some of the tracks, but this is my least favorite Barry score of the series. Hey, even Barry himself thought so in a retrospective interview, so that's gotta count for something. Die Another Day contains one of my favorite gun barrel tracks of the series. That deep guitar, that is awesome. It's got a heck of a banger action track during the pre-title sequence. There are lovely moments of the Bond theme throughout, especially anytime it plays in Cuba. The entering of the Hong Kong hotel and the drive into Iceland. The Welcome to Cuba track is one of my favorite musical tracks from any of the Brosnan era. The most disappointing things about this soundtrack are twofold. First, Arnold went a bit too heavy on the electronics during the action scenes in the second half of the film. It dates the music in a similar way to Eric Serra's or Marvin Hamlish's use of synth in their respective films. But it's almost worse because it kind of feels like a first-year music student just pressing the demo button on a synthesizer and just overlaying that with some orchestral bits. The second issue is that there are several cues here that feel like unused B-material ideas from Arnold's other Brosnan efforts, especially The World Is Not Enough. For example, there's a bit in the music to the Some Kind of a Hero scene that feels a little too similar to the reveal of Elliot Carver in Tomorrow Never Dies, and some bits here actually get recycled into the Casino Royale score, such as a flute flutter that is used during a similar moment. Because of these recycling of the ideas, there isn't really a unique standout theme for this film. I have trouble recalling any unique musical theme even after I just watched the film. It's not like Arnold is taking themes from earlier films and developing them across multiple entries. No, these themes are just different enough from the earlier entries to count as separate themes, and yet they sound too similar to be distinct. Die Another Day is a fair score on its own, it's just not one of the best in the series. Here's a case where I think the score is much better than the film it comes from, and yet I could describe the highlights and issues with A View to a Kill's score in almost the exact same terms as I did with Golden Gun's score. It's got one of the best action themes in the series, which gets reused a lot throughout the film, and the main title theme works well as a romantic theme, and there is a cool motif that's identified with Zorin that plays a couple of times. However, this film's soundtrack has an interesting issue that it exemplifies that I've had with more recent Bond scores. This is going to seem like a bit of a tangent, but hear me out. One of my issues with Daniel Craig's soundtracks is that the composers seem to shy away from the bombastic uses of the Bond theme that characterized so many great musical moments, even as late as the Brosnan era. It always felt like the Bond theme was just begging to be let loose, and the composers just kept holding it back. It made some of these scores feel less like Bond scores and more like solid action ones. Some people have misinterpreted this as meaning that Craig's films use the Bond theme less than other films in the series. Yet, if you actually count the uses of the Bond theme in their respective movies, they actually outnumber a lot of the Roger Moore efforts. A View to a Kill is guilty of the lowest numerical offerings of the Bond theme. I can only really recall one use of the theme beyond the gun barrel, and that's extremely disappointing to me. It means unless I want to re-listen to the action theme, which is virtually the same in all 3 or 4 of the scenes it plays in, or the romance theme, there's really nothing of note in the score to me. We've now entered the section of the list where most of the scores are about equal quality with each other, and it just comes down to personal preference. I don't have a lot to say about this one. There's an exotic quality to You Only Live Twice, as it uses some Japanese styles and instruments throughout, especially during the wedding scene between Bond and Kissy. There are memorable bits of suspense and adventure in this score. My favorite track in the whole score is Bond Averts World War III, which is the action bit that plays during the climax. I love the lush orchestrations of the main title theme, too. It's a really fine score altogether. I just don't come back to it as often as I should because I just prefer the other ones. Beauty is the word I would associate with Moonraker's score. I'm just in awe of how Barry gives this one a unique identity, and it makes for one of the most beautiful scores in the series. Highlights include Bond entering Rio, the flight into space, Kareem's death scene, and the return of the 007 theme, not to be confused with the James Bond theme. Barry seemed to hit upon a sound that he liked for romance, and this score would be very influential in his later works outside of James Bond. It's just not a very exciting score, and it often feels very lethargic in tempo at a lot of points. It also continues a trend from The Spy Who Loved Me about reusing recognizable music from other sources. Sometimes that works, like the fun reference to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and at other points it feels really childish, like the Romeo and Juliet overture that plays when Jaws meets his girlfriend for the first time. Barry had to score this one in France, and thus the sound of the score is very different to his other offerings, due, I suspect, to French preferences in recording and mixing techniques. Unfortunately, this has led to a sad circumstance in which the master sessions were lost, and the score can't properly be remastered in the same way that most of the other scores have been. It's another good score from Barry that excels in one area, it just falters in some others. My goodness, Barry likes his brass in this score. Goldfinger's music is where John Barry really came to define the sound of the series, and it's probably the most influential of all the James Bond soundtracks. Whenever anyone thinks of classic spy music, it's probably something fairly close to this offering. It checks off a lot of my requirements of what I want to see from a good score. Good uses of the Bond theme, the main title song used throughout, and memorable bits of music in other places. The laser beam sequence is a particular highlight of mine from this score, as it's a suspense piece that subtly uses the main hook from the title song to show that Bond's life is always in the villain's hands. It shows who has the power in the scene. It's a more intelligent use of motifs from the Sean Connery era, and I believe it's half the reason that scene is so memorable. It's actually kind of amazing we have a score here that doesn't use the Bond theme as much, and yet still finds a way to feel like a Bond score. There's a few more to come on this list that I think show how to do that just as well. It's the third in a row on this list of good John Barry scores where I can see people making a solid argument that it's one of the best. I've already talked about some of the pitfalls this score is in danger of falling into. Too many electronics during action bits and recycled cue ideas. And yet, incredibly, I don't think that The World Is Not Enough goes as far into the danger zone as Die Another Day did. Exciting is definitely a word I would use to describe this soundtrack. The action cues are the best that Arnold did post Tomorrow Never Dies. And I can't help but smile when the Bond theme creeps back into the score. It gets me pumped. I actually want to like the score a lot more because it does have some really rich moments of filler music. Bond at the airfield, the casino bit, the transition between MI6's Scottish headquarters and the BMW Z8 in Baku. However, it really is the action music that elevates this above other efforts, as much of the score showcases generic David Arnold spy music. That's fine, as many of John Barry's scores do the same thing. It does make most of the soundtrack feel a bit too safe for my taste. I do really appreciate the use of Garbage's theme in some more understated ways throughout. The World Is Not Enough really is a fine Bond score that feels like it's just on the edge of offering a great one. I was really nervous when Hans Zimmer was announced as the replacement composer for No Time to Die. He is fantastic, but some of his more recent entries have lacked the musical complexity that I know he can do. And some of his best action music doesn't seem to be as unique within his discography. Pirates of the Caribbean essentially reuses musical ideas from Crimson Tide and The Rock. For such an emotionally hard-hitting film as No Time to Die, I was worried that Zimmer might not be up to the challenge. Thankfully, I was wrong, and this has been one of my favorite scores of his post-Inception. Hans seems to get the heritage of the series and employs both the Bond theme and the main title's melody in wonderful ways throughout. I very much applaud Zimmer for not being afraid of the Bond theme during action set pieces. Using Johnny Marr as the guitarist was a welcome surprise to me. My only gripe with that choice is that a full version of his take of the Bond theme wasn't put on the soundtrack. Back to MI6 is the most exciting version of the Bond theme that we've heard since the end of Casino Royale. Also, I can't tell you how happy I was that the No Time to Die melody was incorporated into the score. Ever since The World Is Not Enough, the series has been seeming to let that tradition die, and I was sad to see that happen. No Time to Die is a great melancholy melody that is expertly used throughout the score, and I love Eilish's vocals actually getting used in the soundtrack. The returning themes from the other films are a little bit of a mixed bag. I love the reuse of Vesper's theme at her grave, and I actually really like the reuse of Majesty's theme in a conversation between Bond and M. I'm just not sure I'm fully on board with the return of We Have All the Time in the World. That theme was meant specifically for Bond and Tracy, and using that for nostalgia's sake feels exploitative in a way that the series has never really done before. Part of that could be that I don't like Madeline and Bond together as much as I have some of the other relationships that Bond has had since Majesty's, but I think it's more that it makes Bond and Tracy's relationship feel less special if we can just take their song and plant it into another relationship. It'd be like if an ex and I had a special love song of our own, and I just repurposed the song for the next relationship. It seems to genericify the meaning of the song, which is something I don't want to see happen with Armstrong's tune. It's also a bit of a shame not to give Safin more of an iconic theme, given the role that he plays in Daniel Craig's Ark, bringing it to an end. These are my issues with the score, but other than that, Zimmer has made me believe that there was life to the Bond scores again. Thank you, Hans. After he hit on a winning style from the previous film, David Arnold tried to follow that style again, for better or for worse. My main problem with Quantum of Solace as a film is that it feels like it's trying to recapture the magic of Casino Royale in a way that doesn't seem to fit the requirements of a part 2 of a story arc. Part 2 should be evolutions of Part 1s, not just boiling down the elements of Part 1 into a checklist and then following it in Part 2, only with minor differences. The soundtrack is one of the few aspects of the film that does seem to transcend this issue quite a bit. It does use the Bond theme far more often than Casino Royale did, but it still feels minimal and restrained. It's primarily an orchestral score, but it does contain more techno than before. The main title theme that's used sounds suspiciously similar to both You Know My Name and a song that Arnold would later write for Shirley Bassey, No Good About Goodbye, that's used in place of Another Way to Die. That's probably a wise move, as Another Way to Die doesn't really lend itself to a melodic orchestration, although there is a nice bit played in the hotel with Bond and Fields. I also applaud that David Arnold thought to bring back Vesper's theme, as that would make sense for a true sequel. But it's something that rarely happened in earlier Bond films, probably because earlier films in the series were meant to be standalone sequels, and thus were pretty self-contained. So other than the James Bond theme and occasionally the 007 theme, musical motifs from previous entries rarely got transferred over from film to film. My favorite tracks here include Night at the Opera and Oil Fields, which feature some of the very best espionage music that David Arnold ever did. I would really like for him to come back to the series, but if this has to be his last score for the franchise, it's a really good exit point. Octopussy's score exemplifies the issues I sort of have with John Barry's other Roger Moore films, and yet this is my favorite of those 4 films, at least in terms of soundtrack. He seems to be well-rested and back with a fresh new energy and enthusiasm for traditional Bond scores. Moonraker notwithstanding, because I don't think of that as a traditional Bond score, and it makes for some of his finest work. The Bond theme is back in regular rotation amongst the tracks. The action theme, while not quite as good as A View to a Kill, is still a really engaging one. And I love All Time High as a romantic underscore, that more so than any of the other ballads that Barry had to work with. In fact, this score seemed to be a testbed for some of the ideas that Barry would use for The Living Daylights. Notice that you haven't seen that score on this list yet. While John Barry has often experimented with new instruments and techniques during his later years, this was the last almost completely symphonic score that he did for the Bond series, and Barry shows off the power of the orchestra in a way that other films of the series could only dream of. It's immediately exciting to me, and I really admire the score. My only complaint is that the DNA of this score feels a little too close to some of the other entries that he's done, and I think that could have been fixed somewhat if Barry had decided to go with some Indian instruments to spice it up. But he didn't, and so I really can't rank this one much higher, despite it being a personal favorite of mine amongst John Barry's discography. Much like Moonraker's soundtrack, there is a clear adjective to describe this soundtrack: classy. Diamonds Are Forever contains some of the most stylish lounge kind of music for the series, and it's more what I think a great Bond score should have. The action bits are a bit lackluster, but I like how this music transports me into a world of high society. And while I'm listening to it, I feel like I'm in Bond's world. Although there is one more score to come that I think does this a bit better. While Vegas does a different style of glamour than the Bahamas or Europe, this score shows what would happen if somebody of Bond style blasted into that world, and how Vegas really could be the city of sin and seduction in the classier way that Bond films require. If I may, I think this is the sexiest soundtrack of the series. It does contain some traditional John Barry action and suspense cues, which are the bread and butter of Bond music, but it's everything surrounding those bits that elevates this score so high for me. If James Bond ever listened to his own soundtracks in his life, this feels the closest as to what might be playing in his apartment. Thunderball is the beginning of the more generic Barry suspense and spy music, but it does feel very fresh here, and some of my favorite action cues from the Connery era are here, especially the chateau fight. While the main Thunderball theme isn't used as often as I would like, due to the rush production of Thunderball, the original title song, Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, was available for use, and it's a fantastic melody. It's used wonderfully in suspense moments like the Kiss Kiss Club, romantic moments like the Dance with Domino, and it makes for just a great instrumental jazzy effort for the soundtrack. As far as lyrical versions go, I like both Dionne Warwick's and Shirley Bassey's renditions, though I prefer Warwick's. And while I love the Tom Jones song, I don't think I would have been disappointed if Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang was all we had. The silky, jazzy nature of the score, mixed with traditional Barry spy music, makes this a highlight for me in the Bond discography. Talk about making a statement. Sir George Martin comes in to Live and Let Die with a brand new style that captures the flavor of the film in a way that I think few Bond scores do. While I love traditional John Barry, I think it was very fortuitous that we had a switch up in composers for Roger Moore's debut. Martin is a master of orchestration and does a great job of weaving in and out of established themes and original themes very naturally. In addition to the James Bond theme and the Paul McCartney title track, he creates some original melodies to help carry the film, and it definitely helps to tell the story. It's not a musical style that I think would work well with the rest of the series, but given how the Bond films were being made as standalone adventures at this time, I really love when composers take a chance with a new style to help the film stand out more. We've seen some examples where I don't think that worked quite as well, like Marvin Hamlish's Spy Who Loved Me, but there are still a few more to come on my list that carry on the legacy and lessons from Live and Let Die. Plus, the soundtrack album to this film does exactly what I wanted to see from No Time to Die's album. It gives us a unique version of the Bond theme to go with the film. The rendition that's used with the taxi cab in New York is one of my favorite versions of the Bond theme and retains the best elements of that theme. I can't help but start to tap my toes when I listen to the score. To repeat myself from my films ranking, it's so funky and fun and different that I can't help but put this up with the best of the series. The first notes of the gun barrel hit harder than any of the other films that came before. And after the guitar comes in and finishes up, you've had a lovely little demo for the kind of music you're going to hear. Other Bond films try to do this as well, but License to Kill instantly sets me up for the type of music that is going to be heard throughout the film, and I love it. The Latin influence is a very appropriate one, and while the style of orchestration is very different to Barry, It oddly feels more appropriate for Dalton's take on the character. There's something about the power of this score that sticks with me. There's lovely little character themes throughout, and while it doesn't use the Gladys Knight song all that much, it still feels like a very cohesive and well put together soundtrack. Kamen displays excellent usage of the James Bond theme throughout. My favorite quieter bit in the score is when Bond prepares his sniper rifle, and the action version of the theme is very infectious. It's got such a great build-up that instantly gets me going, and it's a real cheer-out-loud kind of moment when Bond goes fishing for Sanchez's plane during the pre-titles, or how the truck goes on its hind legs to go through the wall of fire during the final action scene. It's enough to make me forego the questioning of the logic as to how Bond managed to break physics to do either of those two stunts. Even besides the Bond theme, I love the use of Spanish guitar throughout the score, and it really helps me to feel like Bond is out of his element during this adventure. Much like Live and Let Die, I'm not sure the style should have been used for other films that came afterwards, but it worked really well with this outing. Side note, Patti LaBelle sings the original version of If You Ask Me To for the end credits here, a song that Celine Dion would later popularize, and it became an early signature hit of hers. I prefer the Dion version, but the LaBelle version does bring a smile to my face. If I haven't mentioned it before, it's becoming harder and harder to put these scores in any definitive order. But this is the point of the list where I think the scores are all top-tier material. Tomorrow Never Dies is an incredible first outing for David Arnold, and kind of became the standard for Bond scores moving forward. Often imitated, even by some of the video game scores, but rarely beat, Tomorrow Never Dies is an instant classic. Like Hans Zimmer, Arnold knew about the history and legacy of the Bond scores before him and cared about paying tribute to them without copying them wholesale. It just feels right within Bond's world. It weaves in and out of its themes very naturally without feeling like anything is dominant. Though there might be one too many uses of the James Bond theme, but I love them all. I also love how Arnold was willing to change up the style of the score to follow the story of the film. There is a progression to the music. As he explains in the music of 007 featurette, the first third is traditional Bond music within a contemporary setting. The second third gets more techno to fit in with the visit to Carver's Branch in Germany, and the last third mixes the two styles and adds in some local flavor. I like this score so much that I instantly bought the 2 CD version that was released recently through La La Land Records, and that version contains some of my favorite cues from the film. I also have to talk about the use of surrender within the film. I too share my opinion with the Bond masses. It's a shame that it got the shaft and was stuck at the end credits. I do like the Sheryl Crow song, but Surrender is much more fitting for the film. Much like Thunderball did with Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Katie Lang's song serves as the melodic theme that runs throughout the film, both in quieter moments and it has some great statements during some action sections. Surrender is one of the best songs in the series and deserves more than any of the others that I've heard to be at the front of a film. Despite that, Tomorrow Never Dies is a lovely addition to the roster of Bond scores, and I'm so glad that David Arnold got more opportunities afterwards to deliver us Bond soundtracks. After impressing everyone with his arrangement of Monty Norman's James Bond theme, John Barry was given his chance to score an entire film, and boy does he not squander the opportunity. A classic in almost every way, From Rush with Love's soundtrack feels like a romantic epic with enough intrigue to accompany any of the best spy films. Lionel Bart's main theme was rightly made an instrumental for the opening titles, and I love its use throughout the film as an accompaniment for Tanya and Bond's romance. It also has wonderful flourishes of the James Bond theme that incorporates bongos, a technique that both David Arnold and Thomas Newman would bring back for their efforts. It also has some of the best environmental character music in the series. It doesn't really sound like Turkey's national style, but it's properly exotic enough, and it's highly enjoyable and relaxing to listen to. It never loses a sense of dark intrigue, though, especially whenever Red Grant pops up, like at St. Sophia, the Hedge Maze, or the train station. In fact, it feels so timeless that when it came time for the 2005 video game, Christopher Leonard's kept the main title theme and emulated a fair amount of the score throughout the game. I must also mention that this is the first of 5 appearances of John Barry's 007 theme, a secondary action theme for the character. It's nowhere near as iconic as the main Bond theme, but I do enjoy its reprisals in several films that came afterwards, like Thunderball, You Only Live Twice, Diamonds Are Forever, and Moonraker, which I was very surprised to hear it show back up in Moonraker. I like its more jovial renditions in those 4 films, but I prefer the intensity and lower register of this first outing. From Russia with Love is definitely one of my favorite soundtracks of the series, and I often see others mention it with great fondness as well. I almost don't even have to describe On Her Majesty's Secret Service's soundtrack. Everyone just seems to know why it's awesome. Listen to the main instrumental title track, and I think you'll be converted over to the side of it's the best secondary action theme in the series. The driving bass is such a fresh element with muted trumpets overlaid that I was surprised not to hear that idea come back for almost 20 years. It's instantly married to the image of the fantastic ski action that Willie Bogner Jr. captured for the film, so much so that I can't help but have this theme in my head whenever I go skiing or snowboarding. The version of the James Bond theme here is also one of John Barry's best, perfectly marrying early synth with the orchestra. It's also quite fittingly the most romantic score of the series, as We Have All the Time in the World is such an emotional piece that captures the beauty of Tracy and Bond's relationship. Even though the actors have some really fine chemistry and Tracy is a really interesting character, I believe this is a case where the score is responsible for about half the impact of the relationship, hence why it kind of feels awkward to use it over any other relationship. There are plenty of other good bits to this soundtrack too. Barry has some striking action bits that keep the intensity going, and he has a great standout suspense piece when Bond infiltrates Gumbold's office. My main bugbear is the Nina track, Do You Know How Christmas Trees Are Grown? I like it fine in an instrumental fashion, but I don't really care for the vocal version that plays a couple of times. Also, just after Tracy gets shot, we have an upbeat version of the James Bond theme. I get that the producers didn't want people leaving the film in such a downer mood, but it really kills the mood and is a terrible juxtaposition with the end scene. Despite that, I really love this soundtrack, and it's a runner-up for Barry's finest hour on the series. By far Arnold's most intelligent offering for James Bond, Casino Royale's soundtrack does 4 things very well. 1, it steps away from the electronics for a bit and allows the orchestra to sing its cues unaided. 2, it creates a love theme that's very tender and yet totally different from On Her Majesty's Secret Service's effort. It works so well that it shows up in 2 later scores of the series, which is a rare feat for any musical theme that's not the James Bond theme. 3, it creates an action theme from the main title theme that substitutes for the Bond theme throughout, as it has some similar chord progressions and feels very Bondian. And 4, the minimal usage of the James Bond theme is one of the only times where I think that made perfect sense for the film, given that Bond has to earn his stripes throughout the film. It does show up at key moments, though, when he does something very Bondian that's reminiscent of earlier films, such as winning the poker tournament to get the Aston Martin, wearing the tux, cheating death, defeating the bad guys at Venice, traveling to the Bahamas. It's a very thoughtful score that, while it doesn't have the energy-pumping excitement of License to Kill, it makes me smile because it feels the closest to a soundtrack worth studying as part of a college course. I really admire the restraint on Arnold's part to go with his well-established style, because the restrained efforts follow the story and themes much better. Besides, there are fewer, more crowd-pleasing moments in a Bond film than when we hear the Bond theme come in at full glory at the end of the film. For the best film in the series, according to me at least, David Arnold delivers an effort that is worthy of that experience. While the previous 3 entries are better scores in a more clinical way, I think, this and the next entry just personally make me smile a bit more. Bill Conti knows how to get the crowd going just with music, and if you need examples, go watch any Rocky film or The Karate Kid. He doesn't disappoint with this sole Bond offering. I questioned director John Glenn's reasoning for getting him. He said that he felt like Conti could offer them the closest thing to John Barry, as Conti delivers something that is nothing like what Barry had done before. And yet, I'm not criticizing the uniqueness of the score. As I've said, sometimes going out on a limb works for the music in the series, and this is the best example. Conti follows the film's story, emotions, and characters in a masterful way without ever losing the escapism that Bond films excel at. His action pieces are incredibly engaging and fun to listen to apart from the scenes themselves, such as A Drive in the Country and the Cortina chase. I love his utilization of the Bond theme throughout the film as well, as he never overdoes it. On a pure thrill level, the moment when Bond delivers his so-called revenge on Not Blofeld during the pre-title sequence never fails to make that moment feel so badass. But it's the use of the main title theme that puts this one over the edge for me. For Your Eyes Only is one of my personal favorite title songs in the series and rarely doesn't make me emotional while I'm listening to it. The instrumental renditions of that theme throughout give me a similar feeling to what I had when I listened to From Russia with Love, and makes me feel like I could slow dance to the song. For Your Eyes Only's soundtrack just touches my heart in a way that few Bond scores could do, and that's got to earn it a high spot on this list. Even after all the soul-searching through a great catalog of soundtracks, The Living Daylights does come out at number 1 for me. I don't expect anybody to agree with me, and that's fine. So why is this one number 1 over all of these other great outings? Because there's never a dull moment in the score for me. It feels like John Barry pulled out all the stops on this one, and while he couldn't have known this would be his last effort for the series, it feels like the ultimate maturation of all of his styles and is a great tribute to what he did well. The suspense music is incredible, like in the Sniper Was a Woman section or the training exercise at Gibraltar. The main title theme gets some great uses throughout the film, like the hotel scene with Bond and Pushkin and the raid on the airbase. The Pretender songs work well both as an action theme and as a romance bit. And Barry brings back the bass that I missed from Majesty's and does a fantastic action version of the Bond theme. That ice chase with the Aston Martin is spectacular. By the time the soundtrack is over, I feel like I've just watched the film again without having to sit through some of the weaker elements. And that's good, because The Living Daylights has always been a film that I felt just short of being one of the all-time great outings in the series. For the best Bond musical experience, nobody does it better for me than John Barry with his final outing. By the way, I love that this is the film where he gets a cameo. I know everyone likes to highlight the main title songs, and believe me, they are well deserving of the conversation, and maybe the subject for another video down the line, but I wanted to highlight the unsung heroes of the franchise with the composers. This series has a fairly rich musical diversity throughout its 60-year history that I never really get tired of rotating through these scores. Like the films, I have my preferences, but they do change around a little bit over the years as I've become more attached to certain scores over time. Is there a favorite soundtrack of yours from the series? Was I too dismissive of Barry's more traditional efforts during the Roger Moore years and too praiseworthy of David Arnold's works? Am I out of my mind for not liking Newman's duology or Hamlisch's Oscar-nominated Turn? Am I too close to For Your Eyes Only and The Living Daylights to see that other works are clearly better? Let me know in the comments. Each of these scores do indeed continue traditions from the previous films and break new ground for future entries in some way. I don't think we will ever get tired of the 4-note progression that leads to some of the most exciting music in film history.